Welcome to a journey through time. If you're already tucked in, the lights are low, and your mind needs somewhere quiet to drift, you're in the right place. Tonight, we won't be telling just any story. This is a legend that really happened. An ancient empire, once the heart of the world, conquered again and again, yet never truly gone. Its name was Persia, or as we know it today, Iran. 5,000 years of history. Kings, poets, revolutions, and quiet rebirths. It all began in a land of sundust and stories that never fell asleep. So slow your breathing. Let your thoughts float across deserts, beneath turquoise domes, and into a place where time seems to pause. Because tonight, we'll hear a story of something extraordinary. Persia never died. It became Iran, the empire that refused to die. 5,000 years of power. Long before the word Persia ever appeared in stone tablets or history textbooks, there was a place in the southwestern corner of what is now Iran, a fertile region called Elam. Think ancient Mesopotamia's mysterious cousin, a little quieter, a little more mountainous, but just as ambitious. The Elamites were building temples, writing in cuneiform, and decorating royal tombs, back when Europe was still mostly forests and confusion. They weren't Persian in the way we think of today, but they set the stage, like an opening act that doesn't headline the show, but totally deserves credit for the vibes. Then, around 1000 BCE, new tribes started trickling in from the Iranian plateau. Among them were the Persians, an Indo-European speaking people with big dreams, cool horses, and strong cheekbones. They settled in a region called Parsa, and their name, it stuck. Now, here's where things start to pick up speed. By the 7th century BCE, a neighboring group called the Medes had taken over most of Iran. They were fierce and organized, and the Persians were technically under their rule, but not for long. Because in the 6th century BCE, along came a man named Cyrus. Cyrus the Great wasn't just a conqueror. He was a strategist, a diplomat, and arguably the ancient world's first PR genius. He united the Persian tribes and then casually overthrew the Medes. Not in a messy coup, mind you. He just kind of absorbed them. Think corporate merger, but with more swords and fewer spreadsheets. And then he did the thing few rulers do. Well, he built something people wanted to join. He conquered Babylon, yes, but instead of looting it, he freed the Jewish captives and let people keep their gods. This was new. This was big, and it made headlines, well, cuneiform headlines, across the region. The Cyrus cylinder, a small clay artifact found in Babylon, is often called the world's first human rights charter. Bit of a stretch maybe, but it's still one of the earliest examples of a ruler bragging about tolerance and diversity instead of just how many heads he could stack outside a gate. Cyrus didn't just build an empire. He built a model. His realm stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west. He was the founder of what would become the Achaemenid Empire, the largest the world had seen at that time. And when he died, he was buried not in a gold-plated ziggurat, but in a simple stone tomb in Pasargadae. No grand pyramid, no towering statue, just a peaceful place with the kind of dignity you'd expect from someone who understood that true power doesn't shout at whispers. So what made this early Persia so compelling? Well, it wasn't just the conquest. It was the culture, the clever balance between strength and tolerance, the fusion of peoples and languages where Babylonians, Lydians, Elamites, and Egyptians all lived under a single political roof and somehow didn't immediately try to set it on fire. In short, Persia began not with a bang, but with a blueprint, and while other empires ruled through fear, the Persians, at least in these early golden years, ruled through respect. Mostly, nobody's perfect, but Cyrus laid the foundation for something rare, an empire people remembered fondly. And trust me, we're just getting started. Cyrus may have built the house, but it was his successors, especially Darius and Xerxes, who installed the plumbing, the Wi-Fi, and the front gates with armed guards. After Cyrus's death, his son Cambyses took over, and naturally did the most ambitious thing he could think of: conquer Egypt. He succeeded more or less, depending on which historian you ask. But things got messy, and after a suspicious camel incident, don't ask, Cambyses died, possibly by his own sword. Enter Darius. I often called Darius the Great. And no, he didn't name himself that. At least not out loud. Darius was a bit of a bureaucratic genius with a warrior streak. He reorganized the empire into satrapies, basically provincial governments, each run by a governor who reported back to him. It was like a franchise model for empire management. You got to keep your culture and local traditions as long as you paid taxes, obeyed Persian law, and didn't start any rebellions before breakfast. Darius also standardized currency, built the Royal Road, a 700-mile highway that made Amazon Prime look sluggish, and introduced an early version of a postal system. That's right, ancient Persia had express mail before most kingdoms had basic literacy. The capital he built at Persepolis. Think of it as the Versailles of the ancient world, minus the powdered wigs. It was all grand columns, detailed reliefs, and inscriptions that said, basically, "Hi, I'm Darius. I conquered this. You're welcome." Then came Xerxes. Yes, that's Xerxes, the one made famous by 300, where he looks like a gold-dipped nightclub bouncer with body piercings for days. In real life, he was more robe and scroll than chains and glitter. But let's not ruin the fun. Xerxes inherited his father's empire and his ambition. In 480 BCE, he launched a massive invasion of Greece. And while he did manage to burn Athens, he ultimately lost the war. Turns out goats on mountain trails and angry Spartans in red cloaks are harder to beat than expected. Still, for all its setbacks in Greece, the Achaemenid Empire remained an absolute powerhouse. At its height, it covered over 5.5 million square kilometers. That's bigger than the Roman Empire, bigger than Alexander's, bigger than your in-laws' opinions during dinner. And here's the thing, it worked. For a while, this was a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-faith state in a time when most people thought tolerance was a type of grain. The Persians let people worship their own gods, speak their own languages, and even carry on their own legal traditions, as long as they didn't mess with imperial business. And the art, oh the art. Delicate stone carvings, majestic winged bulls, golden rhytons shaped like lions. Everything screamed, we are powerful, yes, but also tasteful. Even the empire's administrative language, Aramaic, wasn't Persian. It was practical, universally understood, because Darius didn't need people to speak his tongue just to understand his tax code. But empires rise, and they fall. By the end of Xerxes' reign, cracks began to show. Internal revolts, greedy satraps, court intrigue. You know, classic imperial burnout. Still, for over 2 centuries, the Achaemenids held together, one of the most successful empires the world had ever seen, all without mass surveillance, GPS, or Starbucks on every corner. They ruled not just through force, but through systems. And systems, my sleepy friend, leave long shadows. The ghost of the Achaemenid model will show up again in Rome, in Byzantium, even in the bureaucratic depths of modern Iran. But before that, something very sharp and very Greek is about to come knocking. If Persia were a seasoned chess master, then Alexander the Great was that cocky teenage prodigy who walks in, flips the board, and still wins the game in 10 moves. By the mid-4th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire was showing signs of middle-age crisis. It was still powerful, but bloated. Rulers were more concerned with silk robes and court politics than with, say, preparing for extremely energetic Macedonian invaders. And speaking of which, Alexander, born in 356 BCE, tutored by Aristotle, and probably able to deadlift a warhorse, Alexander of Macedon swept through Asia Minor like it was a weekend hike. He had inherited his father's dream of conquering Persia, and unlike most 20-somethings with delusions of grandeur, he actually followed through. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with about 40,000 troops, a tiny force compared to the Persian armies. But what he lacked in numbers, he made up for in charisma, cunning, and very sharp swords. The Persian king at the time, Darius III, tried to resist. He really did. But Alexander was fast, strategic, and let's be honest, had a touch of that main character energy. The two clashed in several major battles, Granicussus, and finally, Gaugamela. Darius fled, his troops scattered, his empire, 2 centuries in the making, unraveled in less than 4 years. By 330 BCE, Alexander entered Persepolis, the jewel of the empire, the symbol of Persian greatness. And he burned it down. Why, some say it was revenge for the Persians torching Athens a century earlier. Others blame too much wine and a really dramatic party guest named Thais. Either way, the flames were literal and symbolic. But here's where it gets interesting. Alexander didn't just want to defeat Persia. He wanted to be Persia. He adopted Persian dress, married Persian women, appointed Persian officials, even started calling himself King of Asia, which, let's admit, has a nice ring to it. To the Greeks, this was a bit much. They wanted a hero, not a convert. But Alexander saw something in Persian culture, something enduring, sophisticated, and worth continuing, which is kind of like conquering your rival's house and then moving in without changing the wallpaper. Unfortunately, the story takes a familiar turn. Alexander died young, 32 years old, no clear heir, and possibly poisoned, or just the result of a sketchy fever and too many victory feasts. His empire shattered within a decade, carved up by his generals like a very hostile inheritance. Persia, or what had once been Persia, passed into the hands of the Seleucids, one of Alexander's successor states. They spoke Greek, worshipped Zeus, and handed out coins with bearded profiles and thunderbolts. But the land, the people, the culture, still Persian. You see, Persia didn't vanish when Alexander rolled in. It ducked, it adapted, it layered itself beneath the foreign rulers waiting. Even under Hellenistic control, Persian identity lingered in language, religion, architecture, and that uniquely Persian idea that no matter who wears the crown, the soul of the empire endures. Because Persia had done this before. Foreign rule wasn't new. What was new was how long it could outlast the foreigners. Alexander tried to become Persian, and for a moment he almost did. But the empire he conquered, it wasn't finished. It was just hiding in the shadows, getting ready for its next act. If you ever feel like you've lost everything, just remember, ancient Persia once lost its entire empire and then quietly rebuilt it. Twice. After Alexander's death, his generals sliced up the spoils like a dysfunctional family at a will reading. Persia ended up with the Seleucids, who tried their best to make it a mini Greece. They built cities with names like Antioch and Seleucia, put Zeus statues in town squares, and probably annoyed locals with their Mediterranean lunch habits. But the Seleucids were like Airbnb guests who overstayed their welcome. They ruled but never really owned the place. Persian traditions simmered beneath the surface language customs, even religion. The Zoroastrian flame hadn't gone out. It was just flickering behind a temple curtain, waiting for the draft to die down. And around 247 BC, a local power called the Parthians decided it was time to push the Greek guests out. Now the Parthians were a wild bunch. Horse archers, guerrilla tacticians, fabulous mustaches. They didn't build massive stone cities like the Achaemenids. They preferred mobility survival and the occasional surprise decapitation. They ruled for nearly 500 years. And while they didn't bring back Persian glory in the classic sense, they kept things Persian enough. The language was Middle Persian. Zoroastrianism still thrived. And their constant wars with Rome gave them that scrappy underdog vibe everyone loves in bedtime history. If Rome was the disciplined, bureaucratic, straight-A student, Parthia was the creative kid in the back who doodled battle plans in the margins and showed up late but still somehow aced the test. Then in 2124 CE, the Parthians were overthrown by another Persian dynasty, the Sassanids. Now this was the comeback tour. The Sassanids were bold-structured and unapologetically Persian. Their founder, Ardashir IV, basically walked into the royal tent, looked at the Parthians and said, "Nice empire. I'll take it from here." And he did. Under the Sassanids, Persia got serious again. Centralized government, state-backed Zoroastrianism, elaborate rock carvings that said, in stone, "Yes, we're back," and we're fabulous. This was a full cultural revival. Art, architecture, literature all flourished. Cities like Ctesiphon became imperial jewels. Think domes, arches, and textiles, so fancy they'd make Instagram jealous. The Sassanids also had serious rivals, Rome, and later the Byzantines. They fought epic wars that lasted decades, bankrupted empires, and filled history books with the ancient version of awkward neighborhood disputes. And here's something most people forget during this era. Persia wasn't just surviving, it was influencing. Sassanid architecture inspired Islamic mosques. Persian governance shaped the early caliphates. Even their coinage and court customs trickled into Europe. Persia was the cool kid at the back of the historical class again, quiet, mysterious, and somehow making everything better by just existing. But even the Sassanids couldn't outrun history. In the 7th century, a new power emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. Fast, fierce, and carrying a message wrapped in revelation Islam. The Sassanids were exhausted, politically fractured, economically drained, spiritually brittle. When the Arab Muslims arrived, Persia didn't collapse overnight, but it cracked in the right places. By 651 CE, the last Sassanid king was dead, and the empire had fallen. But remember this, Persia wasn't conquered. It converted. The land changed rulers, yes. The people changed faiths eventually. But the Persian soul, that was not up for grabs. Because even under Islamic rule, as we'll see next, Persia did what it does best. It survived, it adapted, and it whispered to history, "Not yet." When Islam arrived in Persia in the 7th century, it didn't just bring swords. It brought ideas, a new faith, a new language, and a new chapter in the long, complicated relationship between power and belief. Now, don't picture this like a movie montage where everyone suddenly trades Zoroastrian temples for minarets and starts quoting Arabic poetry. The transition was gradual, messy, and full of footnotes. The Arab armies defeated the last Sassanid rulers, but they didn't erase Persian identity. Instead, they tried to fit it into a new framework, the Islamic Caliphate. For the first time in centuries, Persia was part of a much larger empire, ruled not by kings with carved beards, but by caliphs quoting scripture. The Umayyads were the first caliphal dynasty, and let's just say, things were rocky. Arabic was enforced as the administrative language. Non-Arabs, even converts to Islam, were treated like second-tier citizens, a group known as Mawali. Not ideal for a proud ancient culture used to being at the top of the civilizational food chain. But Persia, oh Persia, played the long game. By the time the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads in 750 CE, Persian intellectuals, administrators, and poets had quietly worked their way into the fabric of the new empire. It wasn't just survival, it was influence. Baghdad, the Abbasid capital, became a hub of science, philosophy, and literature, much of it thanks to Persian scholars. Ever heard of Algebra Avicenna? The translation movement thanked the Persians. In fact, while Arabic was the language of religion and law, Persian, newly written in Arabic script, became the language of poetry, mysticism, and romance. Think Rumi, Ferdowsi, and Hafez whispering verses in candlelit courts. Speaking of Ferdowsi, he wrote the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. Over 50,000 couplets of Persian epic poetry written in the 10th century, all about pre-Islamic Iran. Heroes, demons, kings, betrayals. It's basically the Persian Iliad, but longer, and with way more family drama. Ferdowsi spent 3 decades writing it, and almost died broke, because he believed Persian identity mattered. That even after centuries of conquest and conversion, the stories had to live on. And they did. Zoroastrianism faded from public life, yes. But Persian culture didn't just survive Islam, it shaped it. Many Islamic practices that people assume are Arab in origin from certain architectural styles to mystical traditions like Sufism, actually have Persian fingerprints all over them. Persian mystics like Al-Ghazali and Rumi helped shape Islamic thought for centuries to come. Even Shia Islam, which would later become Iran's dominant faith, found early theological traction in Persian lands. But we'll come back to that twist in a future section. For now, understand this. While the conquerors arrived with swords and scripture, they left with a deeper respect for the culture they tried to dominate. And Persia didn't disappear into Islam. It blended, it bent, and sometimes it taught. Which raises a sleepy but important point. How many civilizations can be conquered, converted, and still convince the world to speak their poetry? Only one, really, the one that never truly died. If you thought Persia was done reinventing itself, think again, because here comes the Safavid dynasty, rising out of the mists of mysticism, war paint, and yes, very ambitious hats. Let's rewind to the late 15th century. Persia had been under a revolving door of rulers for a while. Arab caliphates, Turkish sultanates, Mongol khans. It was like the empire equivalent of a rental apartment with too many landlords. But beneath all that, something was brewing quietly, patiently, and with some very intense chanting. Enter the Safavids. They began not as warriors, but as a Sufi religious order in Ardabil, a quiet mountain town. Picture monks in wool cloaks, not generals in armor. Their spiritual leader, Sheikh Safi al-Din, preached piety, discipline, and divine love, the good stuff. But a few generations later, his descendants said, "What if we add swords?" And suddenly, the Safavids weren't just lighting candles. They were lighting fires. By the early 1500s, a teenager named Ismail had taken over the movement. He believed he had divine backing, a sacred mission, and absolutely no chill. At 14, he declared himself Shah of Iran. Yes, 14. Most kids that age can't even find their socks. But Ismail wasn't messing around. He rallied the Kizilbash, a fiercely loyal militia with red turbans and a habit of charging first, asking questions later. They swept through Persia like a holy storm, defeating rival tribes and breaking old powers. In 1501, Ismail entered Tabriz and proclaimed Shia Islam as the state religion. Now pause here. This was huge. Until then, most of the Islamic world, including Persia, had been predominantly Sunni. By declaring Shia Islam the official faith, Ismail didn't just change theology. He changed geopolitics. He drew a sharp, glowing line between Persia and its powerful Sunni neighbors, especially the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Uzbeks to the east. It was like installing a religious firewall overnight, and it stuck. Today, Iran remains the world's largest Shia majority nation, and it all began with this moment. The Safavids weren't just spiritual rebels. They were empire builders. They revived Persian institutions, promoted Persian language and art, and styled themselves as heirs to both Islamic and ancient Persian traditions. Their capitals first, Tabriz, then Qazvin, and finally Isfahan, became centers of culture, science, and silk. If you ever visit Isfahan's Nakshe Jahan Square, with its turquoise domes and poetic symmetry, Thank the Safavids. It's the architectural version of a lullaby. Under Shah Abbas the Great, 15D date 1629, the empire reached its golden age. He reorganized the army, built roads and caravanserais, opened trade routes with Europe, and even made deals with the British East India Company, proving that even mystical warrior empires sometimes enjoy a good business lunch. He also moved the capital to Isfahan and said, quite literally, Isfahan is half the world. And honestly, he had a point. The city was breathtaking. But like all great dynasties, the Safavids eventually got too comfortable. Later, rulers lacked Shah Abbas's vision. Court intrigues grew, enemies regrouped. By the 18th century, the empire was weakening. Afghan tribes invaded. The dynasty crumbled, and once again, Persia found itself without a strong central crown. But something had changed permanently. The Safavids had done more than win battles. They'd planted something deep, a religious identity, a cultural revival, a sense of separateness, of Persian uniqueness within the wider Islamic world. The empire faded, but the imprint, oh, it remained. Shia Islam Persian, art, poetic pride, all now standard features of the Iranian identity. So the next time someone tells you a bunch of mystic monks can't reshape a civilization, just nod, sip your tea, and whisper, Safavids. If history were a board game, the 19th century would have been when Persia got stuck between two players who both refused to let go of the dice. On one side, the Russian Empire, cold, calculating, expanding southward, like it had a grudge against warmth. On the other, the British Empire, sipping tea, plotting from India, and inventing strategic interest as a lifestyle. And smack in the middle, Persia, still proud, still Persian, but very much aware that the party was now being hosted by other people. This chapter begins with the Qajars, a Turkic dynasty that took power in the late 1700s after the Safavid collapse, and a rather chaotic period of warlords' invasions and general Game of Thrones energy. Aga Muhammad Khan, the founder of the Qajar dynasty, was intense, to put it mildly. He unified the country, declared Tehran the capital, and ruled with a fist that could bend iron and occasionally crush it. The Qajars brought stability, yes, but also complacency. They were masters of royal pomp, not reform. As Europe industrialized and modernized, the Qajar court mostly collected peacocks. Meanwhile, the world was changing. The British were worried about Russia getting too close to India, their crown jewel. The Russians were worried about the British having too much crown in general. This led to a century-long rivalry historians call the Great Game. And no, it wasn't fun for Persia. Persia was a pawn, a buffer, a bargaining chip. Its borders were carved up in treaties it didn't write. Russia took large chunks of the Caucasus. Britain occupied southern ports. Spheres of influence were drawn like a coloring book, except nobody asked the person living on the page. But Persia didn't roll over. Persian intellectuals and reformers began pushing back. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, calls for modernization grew louder. They wanted schools, railways, a constitution, representation, and maybe a little less foreign meddling. In 1906, after years of pressure, the Qajar king was forced to grant a constitution and form a parliament the Majlis. It was clumsy, it was new, but it was real. And then came oil. Because, of course, there's oil. In 1908, the first major oil discovery in the Middle East happened in Persia. Suddenly, foreign interest spiked like espresso on an empty stomach. The British quickly formed the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, yes, that would eventually become BP, and locked in contracts that, let's just say, were not favorably Persian. While Persia got a trickle of profits, the British got fuel for their navy, and conveniently, another reason to stay involved in Persian affairs. The Qajar rulers were now stuck. On one hand, they needed modernization. On the other, they feared losing even more control. And so, Persia teetered between tradition and progress, nationalism and foreign pressure, royal power and public demand. Rebellions simmered. Assassinations happened. Clerics, merchants, students all became politically active. There was even a tobacco protest in 1891 that united both secular and religious forces. Imagine an entire empire refusing to light up just to say, hey, maybe stop selling us off to foreign companies like weird discounted rugs. The Qajar dynasty was weakened, cornered, and increasingly irrelevant. But Persia was stirring. A new idea was taking root, not just about kings and courts, but about sovereignty, identity, and modern nationhood. Because after centuries of being ruled, invaded, absorbed, and ignored, Persia was ready to choose its next chapter. And the man who would write the next line was waiting just off stage. Let's face it, sometimes history needs a wardrobe change. By the early 20th century, Persia was a nation with a glorious past and a slightly confused present. The Qajar dynasty had fizzled out in a haze of indecision and bad contracts, and the people were done waiting for reform to arrive via telegram. Enter Reza Khan, a tall mustachioed military man with a no-nonsense stare and a love for trains. Reza Khan rose to power the old-fashioned way with a coup. In 1921, he marched into Tehran, declared enough of this nonsense, and began cleaning house. 4 years later, he ditched the old monarchy and crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi. He wasn't descended from the Qajars. He wasn't even from the nobility. But he had something Persia hadn't seen in a long time: ambition, efficiency, and just the right amount of fashionable authoritarianism. Reza Shah's goal: modernize the country and fast. He built railways, opened secular schools, expanded infrastructure, and restricted clerical influence. He banned the veil, westernized the legal system, and generally treated tradition like an old carpet that needed shaking out. But his most symbolic change, the name. In 1935, he formally requested that countries stop referring to the nation as Persia and start calling it Iran. Now, why would he do that? Well, Iran wasn't some brand new invention. It was the local name Iran used by Iranians themselves for centuries, rooted in the word Aryanam, meaning land of the Aryans. Yes, we'll get to the awkward part in a moment. The term Persia came from Parsa, the ancient province that gave the empire its name. Greek historians spread that name to the west, and it stuck like spaghetti on a wall. But Reza Shah wanted something different. Something that signaled strength, modernity, and a national pride, especially to Western powers who still saw Persia as a quaint land of rugs and poetry. So Iran it was. He also admired countries like Germany, which in the 1930s were showcasing discipline order and rather problematic ideologies. Iran wasn't fascist, but it liked the optics of national rebirth, which again sounds noble until you realize who else was doing that dance in Europe at the time. To be fair, Iran was always the endonym. Reza Shah just made it official for outsiders. But here's the twist. Despite the new name, the soul didn't change. Iranians still recited Hafez. They still celebrated Nowruz. They still held onto that invisible thread that connected Cyrus to Ferdowsi to the neighborhoods of Tehran. Reza Shah wanted Iran to look Western. He enforced dress codes, banned tribal clothing, and even made it illegal to walk around in traditional headgear. Yes, people were arrested for their hats. That's how deep the fashion reforms went. But it wasn't all top-down vanity. There were real successes. New roads, better education, industrial development. A growing middle class began to emerge. Women started attending school. Persian identity was being reshaped, not erased. Still, Reza Shah wasn't exactly warm and fuzzy. He centralized power aggressively, silenced opposition, clashed with the clergy, and didn't take criticism, well, a habit that seems to run in dynasties like a family recipe. Then came World War II. Although Iran declared neutrality, Reza Shah flirted a bit too much with the Axis powers. The Allies, especially Britain and the Soviet Union, weren't amused. They invaded in 1941, forced him to abdicate, and sent him into exile. His son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, took the throne. Same family, different approach. Sort of. But the bigger story here, a nation had rebranded, not just in name, but in ambition. Iran was no longer the dusty memory of an ancient empire. It was a modern nation, with trains, with oil, with ideas. And beneath the surface, Persia still hummed quieter now, but far from silent. If modern Iran had a heartbeat, it would be 1979, loud, chaotic, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Let's rewind. After Reza Shah's exile in 1941, his son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, often called the Shah, took the throne. He was young, polished, and at first glance, very photogenic. Think royal charm with a side of international jet lag. The new Shah promised modernization and reform, and for a while it looked like Iran was headed for a sleek, neon-lit future. He built highways, supported women's rights, encouraged industry, and held massive festivals celebrating Persian history, complete with lasers gold and awkward French dignitaries. But here's the thing, for every skyscraper he built, another voice felt silenced. The Shah's rule was increasingly autocratic. His secret police Savak made dissent disappear faster than an ill-timed joke at a royal banquet. Political parties, not welcome. Criticism, even less so. And while the West applauded him as a modernizer, many Iranians saw him as a puppet, specifically an American one, because, well, the CIA literally helped reinstall him. In 1953, Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown in a coup orchestrated by British and American intelligence. Why? Because Mossadegh dared to nationalize Iran's oil. The nerve. The Shah returned stronger, but also more paranoid. He ramped up control, suppressed opposition, and embraced the throne like it came with a lifetime warranty. Meanwhile, cracks began to form. Clerics resented secularization. Intellectuals decried censorship. Students protested. The poor watched wealth bloom in northern Tehran, but not in their neighborhoods. And in the background, one man had been watching quietly, patiently in exile. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a Shia cleric with fiery speeches and unwavering conviction. Khomeini had been exiled for criticizing the Shah's regime. But tapes of his sermons, yes, cassette tapes, the TikTok of 1979 circulated through bazaars, dorm rooms, and mosques like wildfire. By the late 1970s, the country was a powder keg. In January 1679, the Shah fled Iran. In February, Khomeini returned to a hero's welcome. And just like that, the monarchy that had ruled Persia in one form or another for over 2,500 years was gone. Cue the Islamic Republic. In theory, this was a new experiment, a democracy guided by religion. In practice, it became a theocracy with elected elements, all under the watchful eye of the supreme leader Khomeini himself. Suddenly, the clergy were no longer whispering in the shadows. They were in charge courts, laws, education, media. Everything was Islamized. Hijabs became mandatory. Western music was banned. Alcohol vanished like magic. Well, most of it. To the West, this was stunning. One minute they were selling arms to the Shah. The next, they were facing a regime that called them the Great Satan. Then came the hostage crisis. In November 1979, a group of Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, capturing 52 American diplomats and staff. For 444 days, the world watched, and the U.S. seethed. Any hope of reconciliation evaporated like water in the desert, and the fallout, it's still falling. The US and Iran haven't had formal diplomatic relations since. Sanctions followed. Tensions escalated. And for decades, Iran's revolution became the lens through which the West viewed the Middle East, often with confusion, sometimes with fear. But inside Iran, the story is more complex. To many, the revolution was a rejection of imperialism, of being used, sold, and manipulated by foreign powers. To others, it was the return of spiritual dignity. And to some, it became a new kind of suppression, wearing old robes. Because revolutions, like empires, don't come with warranties. Iran's new government faced internal dissent, economic hardship, war with Iraq, and global isolation. But it endured, because beneath the politics, there was something deeper, an old empire still fighting to define itself, not as Persia, not as a Western clone, but as something entirely its own, a hybrid of ancient and modern, sacred and rebellious. And the story's not over. It's easy to look at modern Iran and think, this is a different world. Concrete jungles, smartphones, ayatollahs on TV, women in chadors, young men in Levi's, subway trains humming beneath ancient hills, a mashup of centuries, side by side, like a Spotify playlist made by a time traveler. But if you listen closely, really closely, Persia is still there, humming beneath the surface like an old song everyone still somehow knows the words to. Let's start with the obvious. Iran is not a monarchy anymore. It's not secular, It's not fully democratic, and it's certainly not run by emperors building royal roads and carving battle scenes into stone. Instead, it's a complex, contradictory blend of theocratic control, electoral politics, underground culture, and very loud poetry nights. And yet the echoes remain. Take Nowruz, the Persian New Year, still celebrated every March, just as it was over 2,500 years ago during the Achaemenid reign. Families gather, set up a table with symbolic items, and light candles to welcome the spring. No matter who's in charge, no matter what the law says, the ancient calendar ticks on stubborn and joyful. Or consider the Persian language. Yes, it uses the Arabic script. Yes, it absorbed many Arabic words after the Islamic conquest. But its grammar, its soul, and its literary pride, purely Persian. Poets like Rumi Hafez and Ferdowsi aren't dusty museum pieces. They're national heroes quoted on billboards and school exams. Even the architecture tells the story. Mosques in Isfahan echo the precision of Persepolis. Tile mosaics shimmer with ancient geometry. The dome, the arch, the garden courtyard all nod to pre-Islamic design, even as they serve modern faith. But Persia doesn't just haunt buildings and festivals. It haunts ideas, the pride, the resistance, the sense that Iran is different, older, wiser, misunderstood, that it's a civilizational heavyweight in a world that often sees it only through the lens of politics or conflict. You see it in the way Iranian cinema tells stories, quiet, philosophical, packed with metaphors. You see it in the way young Iranians protest passionately, poetically, often quoting ancient verses between viral hashtags. You even see it in the way the state frames itself, not just as a country, but as a moral power, a continuation of something grand. That's not new, that's Persian. Of course, there are tensions. Many Iranians feel stuck between past and present, between tradition and change, between the myths they're told and the realities they live. Censorship clashes with creativity. Faith collides with freedom. And yet, somehow people adapt. They always have, because that's the secret of Persia's survival. Not brute strength, not imperial conquest, but flexibility. The ability to be conquered, yet not consumed. To change costumes, yet keep the script. Even today, when the world shouts about nuclear talks or sanctions or headlines, too loud for bedtime, Iran's heart beats in quieter places, in gardens, in kitchens, in books, in stories told at midnight under a single light bulb. Persia never died. It just learned how to whisper. And now, here we are. The lights are low. The empire is quiet. And your eyes, I imagine, are gently closing. You've traveled through 5,000 years tonight. Through kings and poets, rebels and robes, secrets, revolutions and revival. Through fire temples and oil fields, silk roads and soundless archives. And what do we find at the end of this long journey? A land that refuses to be forgotten. Persia or Iran or whatever name history uses next is not just a country. It's a survivor, a storyteller, a dream that folds itself into every new century, tattered but never torn. It wears different faces, Zoroastrian, Shur, revolutionary, rebellious. But behind each mask, the soul remains. Maybe that's the real magic. that no matter who builds the palace or tears it down, the songs still play, the verses still rhyme, the garden still blooms in spring. So tonight, as you drift asleep, let your thoughts wander through those ancient halls, not with sorrow, but with wonder. Because Persia is not just in the past, it's still here, in language, in memory, in the soft murmur of history, gently, endlessly reminding us some empires don't end, they endure.